People want this dude dead. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for the country to see this going on.
We're in for just a continued rocky few months of just increased volatility.
China's taking over Hong Kong. They're not abiding by the rule of law, which Hong Kong has traditionally had, so China's just taking back over. Not only are you personally at risk, but your business is at risk. And if you read between the lines, the U.S. is saying, get out.
What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. My name is Austin Bronner. My man, Cody Shirk. What's going on, dude? How you doing?
Dude, I'm exhausted. I've been on the travel tour, and I think my body's finally saying, tap it out. I've been like flights nonstop for the past couple of months. It caught up to me. I'm dead.
Every time I talk to you, you're like, I'm in a new place, doing a new thing with new people, and your body's just shutting down.
I think, in my 20s, just like anybody, the traveling routine wasn't so bad, but I'm getting old, Austin. My body's saying, slow down, dude.
I feel like at this point, I've been doing a lot of travel as well, and I have to take like extreme measures to keep myself from getting sick, on massive, like tons of supplements, making sure that I'm going to, like, I'll usually put a break in to go to some like sauna, cold plunge sort of thing to recover. I was just in San Francisco and was there for a couple of days with my wife, and it was like a full-on reset. We're like, all right, let's just take 2 days and fully reset, because my son's been waking up at 5:30 every single day for the last month, and that the difference between 5:30 and 6:30 is a whole world.
Yeah, man. Well, first of all, do you believe in those supplements, like the airborne and the vitamin C and the emergency? Does that stuff work, or is that just like snake oil?
I think a lot of that stuff is dusted with supplements. It's not like as strong. I take like a very, very good multivitamin from Seeking Health. I take liposomal vitamin C, a bunch like Shilajit, a bunch of other things. And I take I feel like the airborne stuff, if you can get it, here's the test. If you can buy it at the airport, it's probably not that good. If you got to buy it from some specialty, supplement person online, the quality is probably there. That's the big question mark in my mind.
Well, I don't know what works to prevent it, but I'll tell you
I'm going to get you on my stack.
I know what works to get sick. If everybody's interested, have like 2 or 3 beers and then get on a red-eye flight. Guaranteed you'll get a head
sickness.
cold. Like just every time. I'm an expert at that.
Guaranteed sickness. Okay, speaking of sickness, let's transition to our first topic here. So we are kind of diving in. We are the day after, or maybe the second day after, the second Trump assassination attempt. So, second Trump assassination attempt on the golf course. Apparently, this guy, Ryan Routh, was camped out in a wooded area with a loaded SKS-style rifle near the golf course for over 12 hours with a stockpile of food ready to go, a GoPro, before he was spotted by Secret Service and then, quote-unquote, engaged. I still don't know exactly what that means. It sounds like they shot at him and he went on the run. Second attempted assassination in less than 2 months. U.S. political instability continues. What are your thoughts here? What is your initial knee-jerk take on second assassination attempt?
People want this dude dead.
They want him dead.
It's kind of funny on the superficial level, just like, oh my God, this is how much people hate this dude. But at the same time, it's also, you look back into history, and I actually looked this up. There's like the assassination attempts of multiple leaders, and there's actually a whole list of people way ahead of Trump. Like there's some people have like hundreds of assassination attempts.
Hundreds, yeah. I'm sure they're more than these two. These are just like the ones that have broken through,
Yeah, and also we live in an age of social media and all that, so it's just like in your face. But yeah, my gut reaction is that there's people in the public that want this dude dead, and that's probably from both sides of the aisle, just saying ridiculous things about our democracy dying or people overthrowing the government or whatever. And then my second thought is the deep state doesn't want this dude in there. He's a significant threat to the deep state. When I say deep state, I just mean the general bureaucracy of DC and Washington, but also globally, of these people looking at Trump and saying, like, you're not one of us. You're not one of the multi-generational political superpowers. You already shook it up last time. you were in office and we don't want you back. And, whether or not that deep state is helping these people try and off him, I don't know. But it's certainly suspicious. I mean, look at what happened to Kennedy. It's just like, he was a total disruptor of the deep state, and he got shot. And I don't know what's going to happen with Trump here, but it's certainly not surprising.
Totally agree. I feel like there's a couple things going on. Things I look at, I don't know if you're on Twitter, you can kind of see they screenshotted a lot of the guy's tweets over the last year, and all the guy was talking about was Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. He was fully bought in that this is the most important thing on the world stage, and that the U.S. needed to be fully supportive of what was going on in Ukraine. He even flew to Ukraine multiple times, tried to volunteer, raised money, was being interviewed on multiple news stations in different newspapers about Ukraine. And my biggest takeaway from that is perception is reality. And when you have a, quote, like deep state connected to media working lockstep to promote a reality of what's happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in our own country, there are certain people who will take that to the extreme. And small little comments about what should be done or the importance of, winning the war in Ukraine can lead to downstream effects, second order consequences of nut jobs who decide they got to take it into their own hands. And my biggest takeaway right now with a lot of this political instability is that I feel like we just don't know in terms of investing in the markets, in terms of just general stability. We're in for just a continued rocky few months of just increased volatility. Don't know what's going to happen.
And I think also the bigger picture here is that the world is unfamiliar with volatility. Like you said, not only in markets volatility, but just global political instability. We've had 100 years since World War II of basically an American-led global dominance. Of course, there's been lots of conflict, but away from America and away from most Western nations. So there's this belief that it will continue to be like that. But historically speaking, there's cycles, and we're absolutely due for some sort of cycle of more volatility and perhaps more actual conflict. Of course, nobody hopes that happens, but you look at history and we've had so much peace in the West for so long. It's almost an anomaly. Actually, it isn't an anomaly.
It is an anomaly.
Seeing what's happening with Trump, I mean, of course, it's not. I don't think anybody on either side of the aisle wants this to happen. This is not something that is even. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for the country to see this going on. But at the same time, you have people that disagree with each other so much that they're willing to take action like this. Just shows what's ahead of us for the world, meaning that these conflicts, which go across economics, culture, policy, all that, it's just getting more and more intense. And the only way to solve that, unfortunately, is probably by increased conflict until it climaxes somehow.
I see that. I see that coming. I also think about volatility. I think that there's a negative connotation with volatility, right? Always volatility. People think of it as always negative. Volatility doesn't necessarily mean always negative. Bitcoin is volatile. It goes up and it goes down. And what happens during volatile periods is that you can make periods of, there could be downturns and there can be upswings and changes that happen really, really fast. And that's the part that I think gets forgotten about volatility. Periods of volatility is sometimes at the end of these periods of volatility, massive breakthroughs and changes happen. And I think that's a lot of the eyes on Trump and the people that don't want Trump to succeed. A lot of it comes down to just establishment versus change. And there's many interviews that have come out recently talking about how he's been regretful about the way that he managed the first time in office, and that a lot of the people that he brought in were some of the more traditional neocons that are quote unquote deep state, or they have the establishment view about foreign policy. And a lot of what he's talking about this time is that he made a mistake putting those people in his cabinet, and this time he will not. And that's where there's even more friction, I think, related to just wanting him to not succeed and get back into office.
Yeah, and I think there's an argument too for volatility. Actually, low volatility for the long term is actually a bad thing, because low volatility for an extended amount of time means that when you do have volatility, it's going to be outsized.
Yeah.
So, and we see that in the markets. We had this huge volatility spike a couple months ago, and it just completely upended a bunch of different investments and different trades. But culturally, it's the same thing. So if you have a republic or some sort of democracy that every several years they kind of battle it out at the poll booths, But things kind of go along. That's actually a healthy thing because you have open dialogue, you have open communication, you're solving things in real time.
Yeah.
But if you go 20, 30, 40, 50 years with just kind of like sweeping anything under the rug, all of a sudden people can get pissed, and that's how you have a civil war and uprising. And I think that's what Trump symbolizes for a lot of people. Trump is saying a lot of these uncomfortable. Well, first of all, his delivery is horrible. I personally just rubs me the wrong way. I'm just like, bro, just please say things a little more elegantly and a little bit like less inflammatory. Although he does have strategy with that. But the topics that he's bringing up, and a lot of times they're relevant, and a lot of people identify with it, and a lot of things he's bringing up have been swept under the rug for the past couple of decades. So it's important things that he's bringing up, and that's why he's getting a lot of support.
There's a great book. So Jared Diamond he's written a couple of books, but one of the ones he wrote more recently was about, he talks a little bit about the difference between what happens in the U.S. and in more, let's say, like dictatorship type countries or places where he was really contrasting China to the US. And in periods of low volatility, China can make a lot of progress because they have effective dictatorship rule, meaning that whatever comes down from the president is going to happen, and it'll move forward, and you'll kind of look from, say, afar and say, wow, they're really making a lot of progress right now. I wish we could make progress like that. When there's periods of gridlock, his argument is that gridlock is actually more of a feature than a bug in democracy, and that during periods where there's gridlock and there's, let's just say, like less volatility because people are grinding up, there's, two parties that are kind of on opposite sides, not much is going to happen. When there's alignment, so much happens, and it'll happen very, very quickly in a democracy. And I think we're moving from a period of like intense gridlock to alignment at some point where lots will shift. And that's where the volatility, in my mind, kind of catalyzes. A lot of it's also described in the fourth turning, but at the end of the day, like a lot of this is going to, for me, I look at it and I see just like continued chaos in the markets over the next few months and maybe longer until a catalyzing event will move forward up or down in a way that we haven't seen for a while.
Yeah, and I forget the saying, but it's something about how communism is progress without the hurdles of democracy or something like that, which basically means exactly what you said. Democracy has all these rough spots that prevent progress, but that could be a feature, just like the U.S., the way the government's set up with the judicial and the executive branches and the congressional and the House, the Senate. Like they're all kind of arguing with each other. We somehow move forward, but there's like a lot of grinding of the gears along the way. But
Totally.
That is a feature. That's part of getting to a more to a consensus that's a more aligned in the future, instead of just having a dictator roll over everybody and then you have a full-on civil revolution 100 years later.
Exactly. On the dictatorship side, it's like everything will look good until it isn't, and then it's just completely flipped. Where that rarely happens in a republic or a democracy the way that we have.
Well, China's a perfect example of that. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen 50 years from now, but they have serious problems.
Even 10 years from now.
Yeah, they have serious demographic problems because of their one-child policy. They have serious monetary debt issues. They got all kinds of problems. Not that other countries don't, but internally in China, it's like that's a pretty bad situation. But what happened 50 years ago? They had full genocide with a dictator. So
exactly.
Repeat again, I hope not, but that's what happens when you have a dictator-led government.
Good transition, because a very interesting advisory came out this last, I think it was about a week and a half ago. There's a couple things going on, specifically in Hong Kong. We've talked about Hong Kong in this podcast before. One of the first episodes, we dove into like the changes in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong continues to deteriorate for Westerners. And the State Department actually just released an advisory, which I'm going to read here, talking a little bit about what's happening in Hong Kong.
This came out last week, right?
Last September 6th. Yep. So they issued a warning to U.S. businesses about the risks and their operations and activities in Hong Kong. The advisory highlights the following. Businesses operating in Hong Kong, as well as individuals conducting business on such companies' behalf, are subject to broad and vague provisions of the NSL and SNS ordinance. Businesses should be aware that extraterritorial application of this ordinance could impact their businesses and individuals outside of Hong Kong. Businesses operating in Hong Kong face potential legal, regulatory, operational, financial, and reputational risks, including of increased scrutiny, potential financial penalties, and legal applications for perceived violations of the NSL and SNS ordinance. So NSL is the national security law. What does this mean? What is this? You dove into the Hong Kong business advisory.
Yeah, so
what is happening over there?
if anybody's listening to this, that sounded like a lot of high
Jargon,
level speak.
massive
Yeah,
jargon,
totally.
yeah.
This was a release from the State Department, the U.S. State Department. It was this basically warning of, hey, if you're doing business in Hong Kong, you better be careful. And it was the statement you just read. But there's a link in that statement. If anybody wants to go there, you can go check on the link. And it opens up this other document. And it's this analysis of the Hong Kong business environment. And it lays out, and it's pretty long, so you don't have to read the whole thing. I'll give you the bullet points. It basically says China's taking over Hong Kong. They're not abiding by the rule of law, which Hong Kong has traditionally had. So China's just taking back over. And if you're in Hong Kong right now, not only are you personally at risk, but your business is at risk. And if you read between the lines, the U.S. is saying get out. So I read this whole thing, and I've been reading this over the past couple of years, as you have too, Austin. And just for listeners, if you didn't listen to our other episode, I've spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. You lived in Macau for a while. We know the area pretty well. Of course, we're not Chinese or Hong Kongers, but I feel like we have some sort of understanding of what's going on over there. But I read this document, and it's a warning, right? It's a warning from the U.S. saying, hey, U.S. citizens, be careful. If you think of it deeper, it could also be a warning of saying, hey, the U.S. may roll out some sort of sanctions / hurdles for U.S. people who are doing business there as well. So the U.S., say a year from now, the U.S. is like, hey, you can't go to Hong Kong or you can't do business there. The U.S. is going to point to this release and be like, look, we told you to get out of there. We told you that it's a risk over there. And of course, I don't know where it's going to go exactly, but if I was living in Hong Kong or doing business there as a U.S. citizen right now, or any Westerner, I would be very, very careful.
At the core, the idea, what they're stating is that, hey, Hong Kong is purporting to be this free trade area, this zone of economic opportunity. It's actually not, and now it's becoming really just more of a part of China, which we've known for a while, right? Since China took back over. And again, most of the expats that I was friends with that lived in Macau and Hong Kong when I was living there have left. They've left over the last decade, and this just continues down that path of a just more clear statement related to it's not. You're effectively doing business in China now if you're doing business in Hong Kong, which is a very different business environment.
And I don't want to be an alarmist, like, oh, don't travel there. You're going to get caught. I don't want listeners to think
Hong Kong's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a super safe city, one of the best food cities in the world, easy to get around, on and on and on and on. But again, I think this is more from the business side of things, just the U.S. putting this warning out, being like, look, we're telling you now, and if something happens in the future, don't say we didn't tell you, because we did.
Let's move to the next kind of order of news story and thing we want to talk about today, which is the U.S. dollar and what's happening. Specifically, I'll set a little bit of the stage here. Right, we're at a point where the U.S. dollar is incredibly powerful internationally right now. You have a very, very strong U.S. dollar. If anyone's been traveling recently to foreign countries, the U.S. dollar is incredibly strong. We talked about it in the episode with talking about what's happening in Japan and the yen. The question is what's happening right now. We've got U.S. debt. At the core, there are some ideas that the U.S. dollar, the strength of the U.S. dollar is either going to drop massively or it's going to maintain its position as the preeminent currency. Cody, why don't you give us kind of a breakdown? What's happening? Why don't you talk a little bit about the U.S. debt, how much debt we've got, and why you're interested in what's happening right now with the U.S. dollar?
So I wanted to talk about this because in the news cycle over the past 6 months, there's been these articles of how, the petrodollar has died. Saudi Arabia ditched the U.S. dollar, and there's a rising of the BRICS nations, and they're going to have a gold-backed currency, and on and on. And when you read this stuff, you're kind of like, wow, is the U.S. in trouble? Is U.S. dollar in trouble here? And then you also look at the U.S. debt and everything you just said. You're like, wow, maybe that's happening. That's really scary. As an international investor, this is, I think, a story that you can get sucked into and get burned on, because the reality is it's just not happening on a lot of levels. And that's what I want to dive into, or we were going to dive into. So first of all, U.S. debt. What's going on with U.S. debt? The wrong way to look at U.S. debt is numerically. You don't want to say like, oh, we have $1 trillion or 100 godzillion dollars of U.S. debt. You want to look at the GDP to debt ratio, which basically shows how much is a country producing compared to how much debt they have. And the U.S. right now is definitely high. I'm not saying it's a healthy level we have right now. In fact, we definitely, when I say we, the U.S. has some issues. I think we're around like over 110% GDP to debt ratio, which means we're we are going in debt faster than we're producing things. That's not, you need to be below that number in order to be sustainable. We are pretty much at the same level we were around World War II, which was when we were spending like crazy to fight a war. We're
1946, we were at 106%. It dropped down to the lowest in 1974 at about 22%, rose up until it peaked again in 1994 at about 47%. And then we dropped down during the Clinton administration to around 31% was the lowest in around 2001. And since then, it's gone effectively straight up to what you said now, about 100 and 110%.
Yeah, and that was a great, kind of showing where we're at. And yes, the last time we were at this level was post World War II, right after World War II, which means we're spending an incredible amount. We're trying to get our economy off the ground. So what's ahead for us? And also, how do we compare? Well, first of all, what's ahead? I want to make note that it seems like an impossible situation to get out, but you can do two things. You can reduce spending and increase production, and that can flip the trend significantly. If you only are doing one, if you're only increasing production, but you're also increasing spending, like you're still in the trouble. So somebody like Trump, like I would personally, I'm like, this guy's probably better at doing it than the other people. But to be fair, Trump totally screwed us over the last time he was in office. He ruined that ratio just as much as any other politician. The bigger picture, like how does this compare to other countries? Because there's this temptation to think that the US dollar is going to sink because we're in so much debt. Well, China's at like 300%.
Yeah.
It was GDP to debt ratio.
280. It finished 2023 at 287%. So 3 times as much as the US.
And honestly, I don't even trust that number. I'm not saying it's higher. It might be. I don't know what it is, but I do know that the way that monetary policy is manipulated within China and the way numbers are mixed around is just, I don't know what's going on. I just know that they're in a bad situation. And to be fair, I could say the same thing about the US. I
don't trust our government, and I definitely don't trust their government.
No, the US constantly is coming out and saying, oh, we're going to redo the numbers, the jobs numbers that we released 6 months ago. We're actually changing it. And it ends up being this change that's not like a little bit. It's like, instead of adding 100,000 jobs, we lost 500,000. Like, how did you screw that number up? And it just goes to show that governments are probably misreporting numbers on purpose. But again, the bigger picture here is the U.S. is definitely got a debt problem. But the U.S. dollar as it stands, is it better than, or is it worse than the yuan in China? Like, no, hell no. China's got a much bigger problem. Is it worse than Japan? No, Japan's got a higher debt load. So it is kind of comparing these things, and you go, well, maybe the dollar's not in that bad of a position.
Yeah, I think this is the effective question right now, because the dollar remains incredibly dominant on a global stage, and there's 2 ideas that are competing right now. One of them is that as rates get dropped, right? There's this idea that they're going to cut rates a little bit. Will that lead to a weakening dollar, or will the dollar kind of ride through and be able to stay strong on international stage while we cut rates? And you talked about this a little bit on a previous podcast, but maybe you can dive in. Why is, in the most simple breakdown, like why is the US dollar strong, even though we have a lot of problems here in the US? Why is it maintained and actually increased strength over the last few years?
Yeah, I want to say on the most simple level possible, which is there's an emotional component to this, which is worldwide, most people trust the US dollar. And that goes from the street level, meaning I could go to a different country and spend US dollars, even though the US dollar isn't the official currency of another country. And most people in that foreign country will accept the US dollar. There's just this general street level assumption that the US dollar is something that holds value compared to other currency. But then on a much higher level, like the highest level, the way that countries hold foreign reserves or do international transactions is still overwhelmingly in the dollar. There's not even a currency that comes even close other than the euro, which is a fraction of what the US dollar is in terms of how much percentage the US dollar has globally. So this idea that something is going to come along and knock off the US dollar, maybe, but a long time from now. And the short term, I think we're still going to be addicted to the dollar for a very long time.
And to the other point is that the interest rates in the US have been higher than they have in almost any other country. So you can go buy, let's say, T-bills in the U.S., hold them, get a return that you wouldn't be able to get, let's say, holding the Japanese yen or in pretty much any other country. Speaking on that, talk a little bit about countries that actually, I mean, you mentioned it's countries that are accepting the U.S. dollar, but there's still also many countries that actually officially rely on the U.S. dollar as their currency entirely.
Yeah, and anybody listening to this podcast, you probably travel the world a lot. And Austin and I, we were talking before we recorded this thing, kind of laughing that no matter where you are in the world, even a place like, I don't know, Canada or Mexico, or even places in Europe, they'll still take the U.S. dollar. Yeah, maybe they'll kind of burn you on the spread on the conversion, but they'll still take it. But countries that officially rely on the U.S. dollar, like it's literally part of their policy. So the U.S., which includes Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands. So that's in the U.S., obviously a huge economy. Then we've got Ecuador, Panama, El Salvador, the British Virgin Islands, which is ironic. They're British. Micronesia, the Caribbean, most of the Caribbean islands, Zimbabwe, a bunch of nations in Africa as well. And then you have countries that unofficially use the US dollar, like they're not officially recognizing it, but when you go on the street level, they're totally doing it, which is everything from Bermuda, Myanmar, Cambodia, Barbados, Bahamas, Somalia, Nicaragua, Vietnam, on and on and on and on and on. And you start to make this list of all these countries, and you're like, wait, holy crap. So in the real world, people are transacting in US dollars, whether it's digital US dollars or physical paper notes. And in the real world, you got hundreds of millions, if not billions of people using the US dollar. And then you go to the argument, which we started out with, which is, oh, the US dollar is going to disappear. And it's almost impossible to suggest some newcomer currency is just going to change the minds of a billion people overnight and they're going to ditch the US dollar.
A lot of it comes back to, I think at the core, it's like there's some serious problems with the US dollar, but there's not a clear other currency that doesn't have problems, right? And that's, I think it's the biggest argument to be made for the US dollar is that, yes, there are challenges in the US, but those challenges are also reflected almost worldwide right now. And back to our conversation earlier about volatility, the volatility that we see in the US is there's volatility in almost every other country. And that is the strongest argument for why the U.S. dollar is going to maintain dominance. From an investor's perspective, what do you see as like the actionable opportunity, or what are you thinking about when you're kind of parsing through these news stories about de-dollarization? What are you thinking about?
When I started investing internationally, this is almost 20 years ago, I kind of had that feeling or projection forecast that the U.S. is in trouble. Like this story has been going on for so long that the U.S. is dying. And this is 20 years ago that I started out with this opinion. And now 20 years later, I'm like, you know what? Not only was I mostly wrong about that, but the countries to bet on and the economies to bet on are still the ones using the U.S. dollar, because as bad as the U.S. situation is monetarily and also internally right now, it's much better than any other place. So as an investor, like where am I looking at opportunities when I'm thinking? It's still U.S. dollar-based economies and U.S. dollar-based companies and U.S. generally led economies. So for example, we were talking like just a moment ago about the percentage of U.S. dollars in trade. Really quickly, I'm going to throw out a couple stats here. 58% of foreign exchange reserves are U.S. dollars. The next in line is like the euro at 20%. Share of export invoicing, 54%. Globally, U.S. dollars. And then share of foreign exchange transactions. So that's exchanging currency globally is 88% the U.S. dollar. It's just like, that's not even... it's not even competition between something else. So you think, okay, well, is the world going to change that much even in 10 years? Probably not. So as an investor, I'm still going to be looking for U.S. dollar-based economies and trade routes.
At the core, my kind of takeaway from what you're talking about, and I thought it was an interesting conversation today, is it's like just stick, while a lot of news has been popping up, at the core, not that much has changed. And yeah, we're probably not going to see a massive change in de-dollarization anytime soon, even if you see a lot of these things.
I would say the one thing that sticks out for people that you're like, oh, what about China and Russia? And what about the Saudis? And they're doing trade in in yuan, or they're doing trade in rubles, or they're doing trade in gold. That's a big one. All the BRICS nations have increased their gold reserves significantly over the past decade. By the way, it's still a fraction of what the U.S. has gold reserve wise. But again, going back to the on the street level, do people do transactions in gold? Are we out like in the 1500s with little like scales, like pouring little
Not happening.
piles? No, like people are not doing that. In fact, I would say there's like a better chance of a cryptocurrency taking over versus gold. I'm a gold bug, by the way. I love gold, but when you see these gold transactions between China and Russia, or between Venezuela and Iran, like that's at government high level, shipments of gold exchanging value. This isn't commerce on a day-to-day level. So this idea that this gold-backed BRICS currency is going to break into the scene and disrupt the US dollar, it's just not going to happen. Maybe it happens a century from now, but for the time being, which is us right now investing in the world and looking for opportunities, it's a distraction almost.
My personal hedge is Bitcoin, and I look at it as a better version of gold. And while it won't replace the US dollar, it does seem like if you hold some Bitcoin, it kind of hedges you against a shift from dollar dominance. And it, like you said, it's more likely that a cryptocurrency will replace or take a larger share of the US dollar, trade in the US dollar, than another currency at this point.
Totally. And I think crypto in general is pretty cumbersome still. Most people don't know how to use it and all that, but tech's catching up.
It's getting better, but it's getting better.
Absolutely. And comparing Bitcoin to gold is probably the best threat I can think of to the US dollar, which I guess is a reason to hold some Bitcoin right now.
Let's go to the last thing I want to talk about, which is one of my favorite Twitter accounts is Nancy Pelosi stock tracker account. And I was just in San Francisco. So I spent the last 2 days the last weekend in San Francisco, walked around a lot. I haven't been to San Francisco for a few years. And, if you're not in San Francisco, like it or not, is a popular topic for people to weigh in on what's going on in San Francisco for people who are outside of San Francisco, people who are inside of San Francisco. You see tech companies moving. You see, Elon pulling X to Texas and shutting down operations in San Francisco. I'll share a little bit of my experience in San Francisco, and we'll talk about what Nancy Pelosi just did, or what they just disclosed about her investments. So I was in San Francisco, mainly in the financial district, but I also walked all around San Francisco, one of my favorite cities in the world. My experience was that, for the most part, the hotspots in San Francisco are back. Right? You walk around, it's beautiful. It's not nearly as dystopian as it can seem online. There are definite pockets of dystopian zombie land in San Francisco. But what really struck me was really in the commercial part of San Francisco, all of the office spaces, all the retail was completely wiped out. So you'd walk around in these beautiful these big, large financial buildings and the commercial real estate buildings. The bottom floor is effectively empty, and it just feels kind of dead. Now, this brings us to what was just disclosed. Nancy Pelosi just invested about $500,000 into an LLC that bought commercial real estate building in downtown San Francisco. Now, the question is the bottom in, right? Does this mean that maybe there's a turnaround coming in commercial real estate, or in some of the policies coming down the pipe for San Francisco? I personally think that a lot of these coastal cities, we have seen kind of the bottom and the worst aspects of what's happening in these cities, and we're going to turn a corner because, one, the experience of being in San Francisco and living there is just too pleasant from a weather, lifestyle, all these sorts of these. There's so much demand to go to a place like San Francisco. It's got to turn around at some point. That's my personal view. I'd love to hear from you. Like, when you see that she's buying commercial real estate in downtown San Francisco, what does that signal to you?
It signals to me that we should buy real estate in San Francisco because Nancy Pelosi is the greatest investor of all time. I say that tongue in cheek, but I'm also kind of serious because If anybody doesn't know or hasn't seen this on Twitter, there's a couple different handles. There's actually a Nancy Pelosi like stock tracker, and then there's the main account, which is called Unusual Whales. Great account, by the way. It tracks all the insider trading of U.S. politicians, and it's going on both sides of the aisle, by the way. Which is these politicians making these kind of like weird trades. Like, why is this guy doing this like huge trade in this company I never heard of? And then 2 months later, some like bill comes out. It's like, oh, the U.S. government just gave $1 billion to XYZ company, and this politician just happened to buy a bunch of calls on it like 2 months earlier. I mean, it's just blatant insider trading. It's so obscene. And Nancy Pelosi is at the top of the list of the people that have done this. She's buying calls in NVIDIA when it was really like, people were like, oh my God, NVIDIA is never going to go above 1,000. And she's like buying crazy calls, and she made, I don't know how much money she made, but a ton of money. And so she's been ahead of the curve on all of these trades. So when I see her buying in San Francisco real estate, I'm like, all right, here's our indicator, boys. Let's pile in now.
Bottoms in. Yeah. I mean, at the core, it's just like, there's no higher level of an insider than Nancy Pelosi. Right, she's got more inside information. I saw a headline this week. India was about to sign some deal to buy $4 billion worth of Predator drones. Yeah, I think the contract was to General Atomics. And you got to wonder, like, that information was out before it was out to us. And so that's just my take is like, yeah, see what's going on here, because there's definitely a public perception of what's happening in San Francisco. And then there's the on the ground experience. And sometimes, quite often, almost all the time, it's different.
Yeah, and just to add real quick on San Francisco, it's going to come back someday. San Francisco is a pretty damn cool city. The location is epic. It's very strategic. It's been a financial hub on the west coast of the U.S. for a century, and will probably
continue.
A
tech hub. And one of the strongest arguments for it recovering is the Peter Thiel argument around AI. I don't know if you've been listening to Peter Thiel recently. He's been on a couple of interviews, but he talks a lot about the difference between AI, the AI boom, and what's happened, let's say, generally in the tech boom over the last decade. A lot of the tech boom in the last decade has been a decentralizing movement where, these tech companies can be built, and they can be built anywhere. So as we shift towards AI, it's a much more centrally managed. A lot of the success that's going to come financially from AI is going to be in one location, not distributed the way that it has been in tech, because of the way that these companies are built, that they have to be a small number of people together, working together at all times. And maybe that just pins it to the Bay Area, and that leads to a revitalization in the Bay Area that we haven't seen. And again, a lot of the challenges that San Francisco faces and the Bay Area faces, they're self-inflicted wounds. They're not existential threats. They could be cleared up pretty quickly if they just change policy regarding policing, regarding sending people to rehab, all these things that have made San Francisco. What's the thing that sucks about San Francisco? It's walking around and having people addicted to drugs who are
defecating all over the
street.
Place.
It feels, it's what I see in all the tech areas in the U.S. Every time I'm in Seattle, San Francisco, tech workers walking around with headphones, avoiding people in the street who have no idea who, where, or what they're doing. And that can be solved fairly quickly with a change in policy. And I think that people are generally fed up. And my take is that we're at the bottom, and it's probably gonna ride out in a different direction.
There's some actionable investments here, though. And the actionable investment is real estate in San Francisco specifically. If you guys go on Twitter and look, there's some accounts to follow San Francisco real estate transactions. So it shows actually like what's actually happening. And I think it's the Ritz-Carlton building. There's apartments in there selling for like $300,000 at 2003 and 4 prices. And what are we, 20 years from now? There's no way you're telling me that real estate is worth what it was 20 years ago. Maybe it was because of the bubble back then and just the big drop. But I would say buying some downtown San Francisco real estate might be a pretty interesting trade right now if the city's on its bottom right now. And also, when you look at markets, when you're at the peak, when you're at the trough, when you're in the moment, it's impossible to know that. I mean, 5-10 years from now, maybe we'll look back and be like, that was the bottom right there, right when Nancy bought into that LLC that's buying up commercial real estate. So
just
follow her trade.
Look at the sentiment as well from some of the top people in tech. Everyone is shifting politically. Not everyone. Many of the top people are shifting politically in their views. They're becoming red pilled. And what's that going to lead to? That I see it as the downstream effect of the top voices in Silicon Valley changing their mind about policies. All that shifts down into the collective consciousness. And then the people who are there on the ground voting and changing, it's going to change their minds, and which will affect politicians just follow the collective kind of mind virus of the day, if that makes sense. It's like whatever people believe, politicians are very quick to shift their sentiment. And so my take is that generally bullish.
SF, bullish. Interesting.
Bullish. Yeah. All right. That's it for the day. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We're going to continue to kind of experiment with some of these different style episodes, maybe more talking about what's happening. Let us know what you think. Shoot us an email. You can email us at austin@adventurecapitalist.com, or Cody, your email.
Just at Cody Shirk on Twitter. You can somehow contact me with smoke signals there.
Let us know. Let us know what you think. And we'll talk to you guys in the next episode.
See ya.